Hello and welcome to Swayam MOOC on British Poetry and Drama. I'm Dr. Vanna Rajoria and I'm very happy to be with you all again. In our last session, we met one of the literature's boldest and most enduring voices, the wife of Beth. Through her, Chaucer gave us a woman who dared to speak her mind about marriage, power, and experience in a world that rarely listened to women. Today, we move 150 years forward from the late medieval imagination to the radiant dawn of English Renaissance, an age of poetry, politics, and human ambition. At the heart of this world stands a figure whose life and death came to define what it meant to be a Renaissance hero, Sir Philip Sidney. But before we take a look at Sir Philip Sidney as a poet and his life, let us take into consideration the learning objectives of today's session. By the end of this session, you'll be able to get a comprehensive understanding of the life, character, and historical context of Sir Philip Sidney as a Renaissance courtier, soldier, and poet. You'll be able to recognize how Sidney's life and death contributed to his myth as a model of Elizabethan virtue and Renaissance humanism. You'll be able to identify and analyze Sidney's major literary works, including Arcadia, Astrophil and Stella, Defense of Poesy, and Sams. You'll be able to understand all of them in terms of their form, style, and theme. By the end of the session, you'll also be able to appreciate Sidney's contribution to English poetry, especially his role in shaping the English sonnet tradition and poetic criticism of the time. You'll be able to evaluate Sidney's enduring legacy in literature and thought and reflect on what it means to live and write as a Renaissance ideal. With that, let us step into the story, not merely of a man, but of a symbol, the man who became the soul of the English Renaissance. This is story of birth of a legend, so pay attention. The air was thick with smoke. The sounds of gunfire had just faded across the muddy fields near the Zutphen in Netherlands. Soldiers lay wounded, groaning, the fury of battle slowly giving way to silence. Among them was a young English officer, not yet 32, carried from the field, bleeding from a musket wound to the thigh. His horse was gone, his leg shattered, his pain unbearable. But as they carried him, he turned his head and saw another soldier, wounded, breathless, thirsty, his eyes fixed on the bottle of water in Sidney's hand. Without hesitation, Sidney passed it to him, whispering, "Thy necessity is yet greater than mine." That man was Sir Philip Sidney, a soldier, a courtier, a scholar, a poet, and in that moment, he became something greater than all four. He became an ideal, an English Achilles, dying not with rage but with quiet grace. In 1,000 years, such a man is born, a hero with the gift of mind, body, and a soul forged in pure gold. On that day, the English muse wept, for she had lost one of her dearest sons. Sidney died too young to complete the legacy he dreamed of. But he lived just long enough to ignite one. This is story of Sir Philip Sidney. A very important question for us to consider here is that why Sidney matters today? Because Sidney is not just a name buried in a dusky textbook. He is the spirit of the English Renaissance. Now, what was this Renaissance really? It was an age that reimagined the human being, celebrating a life of balance between mind, body, spirit, and heart. Sidney lived that balance. Sidney united classical learning with modern ambition. He was both a public servant and a poetic soul. He moved from the glittering courts of Queen Elizabeth to the battlefields of Protestant Europe and left a mark in both. Sidney was admired most as a complete man, gifted with the pen and the sword and intellect. He was admired not just for what he wrote, but for how majestically he lived. Let us look at the origins of this great poet. Philip Sidney was of a noble origin. He was born in 1554 at Penshett, a place in Kent, a grand estate that later poets, including Ben Jonson, would celebrate. He came from a family steeped in influence and diplomacy. His father, Sir Philip Sidney, served as Lord Deputy of Ireland. His uncle, Robert Dudley, the powerful Earl of Leicester, was a favourite of Queen Elizabeth herself. From the very beginning, Sidney was shaped by power, culture, and vision. He studied at Shrewsbury School, where he met his lifelong friend Faugreville. Later, he becomes his biographer. Then he went to attend Christ Church, Oxford, where he encountered brilliant minds like William Camden, Richard Huckelt, and even Walter Raleigh. He was bred in privilege, Grivet would write, but he was trained for greatness. This was not just his education, it was formation of a great hero. Let us take a grand tour, as Sidney starts his travels. In those times, travel was an essential part of education, and Sidney also travelled extensively till 1565. And this journey was not just journey through lands, it was journey through intellect. It refined his mind through exposure, diplomacy, and dangerous encounters. In France, he witnessed one of the era's darkest horrors, the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Protestants were slaughtered. He continued through Germany, Austria, Italy, absorbing Renaissance culture in all its variety. In Venice, he studied history, ethics, and diplomacy. He moved in circles of painters and thinkers, greatest of the time. He was even painted by Venice, a sign of the company he kept. During his time, he started corresponding with great Protestant statesmen and diplomats, and these communications, they deepened Sidney's belief in freedom of conscience and moral duty. To Sidney, the Renaissance was not just about books. It was about seeing, absorbing, and reflecting the world. When he returned to England from the travels, he returned not merely as a courtier, but as a European intellectual, a Protestant, a patriot, and a poet whom the world will celebrate later on. But when Sidney returned to the court, all his education, all his vision and charm, he was dazzling, young, brilliant, good looking. Even Queen Elizabeth took notice of it all. But still, political life was not really very promising for him, and the course of this life rarely went straightforward. Despite diplomatic successes such as his mission to Vienna in 1577, No significant role followed. He was knighted. His knighthood in 1583 was largely ceremonial. He married Frances Wellingham, daughter of Elizabeth's spy master, and still the doors of real power remained closed to him. But Sidney did not let all these political frustrations transform into personal bitterness. Instead, he turned inward, and in that space of stillness and reflection, he began what would be most fruitful and creative phase of his life. Sometimes, when the world outside resists, the door inside opens. This is when Sidney began to write, to turn personal disappointment into great poetry, to become not just a man of action, but a man of words. Now that we have looked at the shaping of Philip Sidney as a man, let us take a moment to look at the great works created by him. Let us turn to Sidney's literary legacy, a body of work crafted in ink but burning with the spirit of Renaissance. These are not just texts, they are reflections of a life lived in pursuit of virtue, beauty, and truth. We begin with his most ambitious and expansive creation, Arcadia. Arcadia basically is a mirror of Renaissance imagination. It is a sprawling pastoral romance written for his sister Mary Herbert, Countess of Pembroke. She herself was a luminous literary figure. Arcadia weaves together themes of love, war, politics, and philosophy. Look at it as a Renaissance epic set in an imagined landscape. Sidney's Arcadia combined the idealism of Plato and the drama of romance. It was England's Aeneid, noble, philosophical, and emotionally charged. Next great work which followed was Astrophel and Stella, the first English sonnet sequence. It was a landmark English lyric poetry, 108 sonnets and 11 songs that launched the English sonnet tradition. Stella represents Penelope, Sidney's muse, a real woman transformed into poetic myth. Its themes include unrequited love, inner conflict, courtly decorum versus emotional honesty, the poet's evolving identity. Sidney created with this work a new language of love in English poetry, English work, while he blended Petrarchan longing, with personal introspective drama. What he did was not just imitation, it was reinvention. Sidney made the English sonnet psychologically come alive. His next work is considered to be a great contribution in the world of criticism. It is A Defense of Poesy. In this, he talks about poet as a creator. It is first sustained work of English literary criticism. It was written in response to attacks on poetry of the time, and Sidney mounted a passionate, powerful defense, elevating poetry above both history and philosophy. According to him, the poet doth grow in effect another nature. In Sidney's world, the poet is not just a mimic, as Plato and others always thought, but he is a powerful moral force, a shaper of souls. He argued that poetry teaches us by delighting, and that the poet is a prophet, imagining the world not as it is, but as it could be. Next work of Sidney was religious in orientation. He created psalms and sacred poetry. It was elegant verse. He translated these with his sister Mary. This work was unpublished in Sidney's lifetime, but it was later admired by people, across generations for its vigor, lyrical grace, and great spiritual depth. It fuses sacred devotion with poetic invention, revealing yet another facet of Sidney's creative and moral range. Now that we have looked at the great works written by Sir Philip Sidney, let us take a moment to consider his writing style, because it was also a mark of genius. Sidney's style was powerful, deliberate, it was shaped by his literary craftsmanship and great political legacy. His works were not only brilliant in thought, but they were also luminous in terms of form, rhythm, and rhetoric. Through both poetry and prose, Sidney showed that English could aspire to the elegance of Latin, the harmony of Italian, and the soul of scripture. All of us know that his greatest contribution was his work in the field of sonnet, and Sidney's most lasting poetic legacy lies in the use of this sonnet form, the way he uses it, particularly in Astrophil and Stella, the first fully developed English sonnet sequence. Before Sidney, English sonneteers like Wyatt and Sadie were still experimenting with petrarchal forms, but Sidney took that model and infused it with psychological complexity and emotional vulnerability. He gave it a kind of dramatic voice that made sonnet, come so original, so natural. It made it come alive. Lines like, "Loving in truth and fain, and where's my love to show? That she, dear she, might take some pleasure of my pain." You can feel the greatness in these lines. From the very first line of his first sonnet, Sidney's speaker is self-aware and ironically detached. He seeks to write truthfully, not just to express love, but to move his beloved, to make her take pleasure in his pain. It's an audacious blend of courtly love and introspective drama. Through his sonnets, Sidney laid the foundation for the dramatic interiority that later on, Shakespeare, Donne, and other writers would perfect. His style was remarkable from the point of view of use of language and, from the point of view of rhetoric also. The elegance of his elevated mind, it is reflected in his style, which is formal, elevated, but still never cold or lifeless. It sparks with invention, tension, and philosophical curiosity. As students of literature, you need to understand the key features of Sidney's style. Key features of Sidney's style include antithesis, which is balancing opposites to reflect inner conflict. Lines like, "Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know." Here see, cause and effect are carefully layered in parallel forms. And what is the effect? It dramatizes the hope. Sidney next uses rhetorical questions to dramatize emotional uncertainty. So he says, "What may words say? Or what may words not say?" Sidney's speaker questions the very limits of his craft, Apart from antithesis and such balancing, Sidney also uses extended metaphor, comparing poetry to warfare realism, politics, or even anatomy. Thus, you could look at a line from his sonnet, thus great with child to speak and helpless in my throes. Sonnet 1 here ends with an astonishing metaphor. The act of poetic creation becomes physical labor, process of giving birth. And what is being born here is truthful poetry through, great language. Sidney shows us that sonnet can be not only a lover's lament, but also a philosophical experiment and a poetic battlefield. In his poems, sound and rhythm, they weave music into the thought. Thoughts sound musical. Sidney's verse is built on iambic pentameters, but he doesn't blindly follow the meter. He bends it and stretches it to reflect emotions. His mastery of enjambment, caesura, and internal variations allows him to dramatize, every experience, hesitation, excitement, despair, hope, longing, whatnot. In sonnet number 1, for example, the final line, "Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write." It breaks the formal momentum with sudden simplicity. It lands like an epiphany. The voice of the muse cuts through all artifice, bringing truth to the fore. This line shows Sidney's genius. He builds an ornate, poetic edifice, only to bring it crashing down with one direct command. The contrast energizes the sonnet, making it not just clever, but memorable also. His experimentation in style, it could be reflected in the classical circle, Areopagus. It was basically Sidney's experiment, So, with his friends, Edward Dyer, Faugreville, Edmund Spenser formed a quasi-literary circle called Areopagus. What was the goal of this circle? The goal was to elevate English poetry by incorporating classical meter and discipline. Sidney attempted to bring in classical hexameter and suffix, structured strophic forms. He brought quantitative rhythm based on vowel lengths, largely considered unnatural to English in his times. Through such experiments, he ultimately succeeded in, showing the great strength English language had as a language of verse. It showed Sidney's aspiration to make English as elegant, as ordered, and as virtuous as classical Latin verse. In many ways, Sidney can be, considered English Virgil. The prose style of Sidney, as you find it in Architecture of Arcadia, it is also richly ornate. He had an ear for music, so even his prose is sometimes dense, but always musical. He layers dialogue with philosophical insight, theatrical scene setting, and poetic digression. Sidney learned forms from different places, but he just didn't borrow these forms. He remade them. He made them his own. Actually, he wanted English to sing like Latin, feel like Italian, grand, majestic, but to speak like England's own heart, deeply individual. His stylistic vision wasn't just aesthetic, it was moral and it was national. Sidney helped shape what English literature could sound like: refined, earnest, witty, and deeply conscious of virtue. His genius was not, simply in what he wrote, but in how he shaped a new English poetic identity where style became a mirror of soul. But just as Sidney gave life to language, he gave nobility to action. So let us now turn from the stylus to the sword, because Sidney not only wrote majestically but also lived majestically. Let us turn to the battlefield where this poet knight would meet his fate, where his legend would begin. Sidney's life, approached its end in the battle at Zutphen. So by 1585, Sidney had become a renowned poet. He had become a celebrated soldier. Sidney was appointed governor of Flushing in Netherlands, part of England's military and political support for the Protestant cause against Catholic Spain. It was a volatile movement. Faith, empire, and identity were all at stake. And Sidney, ever the idealist, saw this not just as a war, but as his duty to his nation, to his motherland, to humanity. On 22nd September 1586, during a skirmish near the town of Zutphen, Sidney led a charge to block Spanish supply lines. He chose not to wear thigh armor, not because of arrogance, but out of solidarity. He reportedly said he would not go better protected than his soldiers, meaning he would only use as much protection as his soldiers, his men can. As sad fate would have it, a musket ball struck him in the leg. He was carried away from the field, bleeding, in pain. He saw a dying soldier beside him, looking longingly at Sidney's flask of water. Without hesitation, Sidney handed it to him, saying, "Thy necessity is yet greater than mine." 3 weeks later, he died of infection. He was only 31. He fell with honor and rose into a legend. He died a death that defined a whole era. Sidney's death was not just a national tragedy, it became a cultural event. His closest friend, Froc Revel, shaped much of the story that survives today. Greville made sure that his story, his heroism, the tale of the water bottle and everything was preserved. He underlined the refusal to wear armor. He helped Sidney become what he deserved to be, more than a man. He made him a myth. Sidney was buried with great ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral, and across Europe the elegies poured in. Elegies were the songs which mourned death of a close one. So from Oxford, from Cambridge, from Protestant poets, even Catholic admirers alike. In England, the whole literary world mourned. Edmund Spenser, Thomas Nash, Matthew Raydon, and even Walter Raleigh, all of them composed tributes. Sidney's death became a kind of literary coronation. His silence began 1,000 voices. This is also a point to note that strangely all major works of Sidney were published in his lifetime. After his death, his sister, the remarkable Mary Herbert, Countess of Pembroke, and his circle ensured that his genius would not be lost. Arcadia, his personal romance, appeared in a revised form edited by Greville in 1590, and its hybrid version combining both old and new was published in 1593. Astrophel and Stella was pirated in 1591. It was quickly authorized and became a landmark English lyric. Defense of Poesy it finally again emerged in 1595 as a powerful manifesto for poetry in an age of doubt. Psalms, translated with his sisters, they remained unpublished till 1823, but later on were praised for their elegance. So, what remains of Sidney today? As students of literature, you would understand in a word everything. He became the gold standard of English virtue, a poet with a vision, a courtier with loyalty, a soldier with courage, a Christian with humility. Even W.B. Yeats, the great modern poet, centuries later, could not help but call, this man our Sidney and our perfect man. He inspired so many poets. Spenser called him president of nobleness. Johnson and Milton extended his ideals. The rise of literary criticism through defense of poesy again was celebrated across the globe. English sonnets, Astrophil and Stella. Sidney just not shaped English literature, he helped shape the English imagination. With this, we come to an end of the discussions of this great poet and his story. Let us take a moment to recapitulate all that we have learned today. Sidney was born into nobility, but he earned his name through honor and intellect. He travelled, absorbed the influences of Renaissance, observed, through entire European circle, and, the political and other disappointments which life gave him, he transformed it into great literary achievements. He created Astrophil and Stella, one of the greatest sonnet sequence of his time. He defended poetry for its moral force of imagination. He blended classical fire with, English form and flair. Though he died young, but his story, his myth, his flame endures. And through Greville's hands and Pembroke's devotion, his voice became the voice of an age. Sidney lived as he wrote, nobly, passionately, and with purpose. He may have died with a musket wound, but he rose into a legend and into the very heart of English letters. This is all about Sidney today. In the next session, we'll step into the radiant and restless world of Astrophil and Stella and experience Sidney's poetic voice come fully alive. We'll explore love, frustration, longing, birth of a poetic self. So this is all for today. See you in the next session. Thank you.